computer. Yeah, it's recording.
Okay, so pretty much welcome everyone to the first workshop in our series of workshops on the digital archiving of social media data in the context of the crisis event. My name is Mikola. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bern. And it's really a great pleasure for me to actually help in co-organizing this series of workshops with a wonderful team that we actually got on board. And there are definitely quite some names. So we got me, we got also Ani Bagumian from the University of Bern, and Ani is my brilliant colleague. We also got Alexander Uyman from the University of Zurich. And then we also got quite some people from the Ukrainian Center for Urban History, some of whom I'm actually very happy to see on the screen. So we got Taras Nazaruk, Bogdan Shumelovich, and we also got Victoria Panas and also Mariana Mazurek. And finally, we also kindly assisted by our student assistant in Bern, Desiree Friedrich. And pretty much, I think that it's everything on my side. I just really wanted to note that one of the main purposes of the workshop series is indeed to stock and also to think together about the technical, ethical, and all kind of challenges in relation to the archiving social media data, which is also of special importance considering a number of projects that our colleagues from the Center for Urban History are running in terms of the actual archiving social media data in the context of the war in Ukraine. And maybe, hi Sasha, it is one of our other co-organizers. And maybe Taras or Bogdan would actually like to tell a couple of words about the side of the things. And then we would actually jump into the Jeff's talk.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mikola. Hello, everyone. And thank you for organizing this in general for this initiative and for organizing this workshop series. To you, Mikola, to you, Ani, and to all the colleagues who organized this, because this is something that we actually we really need it. As Mikola mentioned, we started several archiving initiatives here at the Center for Urban History in Lviv since the war started, and these kind of initiatives are realized in different fields. There are oral history testimonies collected, there are audiovisual material collected, but there is also another direction that I'm mostly involved in and working on is Telegram archiving, so social media archiving of this war. And this was kind of emergency archiving. So something that we started very rapidly and without any previous training or expertise in doing social media archiving. So we immediately also faced with a lot of issues and challenges that we have to deal with, and we still keep struggling with looking for answers to many actual various questions. So this kind of initiative basically originates from this need to talk about that, because like the main idea is to discuss other similar projects and to learn from the experience of colleagues who've been working on similar or relevant initiatives elsewhere. So I'm really looking forward to hear about your project, Jeff, and thank you for also for accepting this invitation and sharing with us about your project. I don't know, maybe Bogdan wants to say about his archiving initiative.
I just want to add that this is an initiative that develops on the way, on the run. We learn a lot while doing many things, and some of my colleagues who are also here, they work with oral interviews, oral history. We record various testimonies, we record diaries, dreams, social media. So whenever we can do, we do. But for this, it's like in therapy. You always need kind of some referent group. And in each project, we try to set up such initiatives to discuss what we are doing. And this project is mainly made by University of Bern, and we are very thankful for this, and we hope that this kind of reference group will help us also to understand what we are doing while listening to what you are doing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Taras. Thank you very much, Bogdan. Then just a fast recap of the workshop plan. So pretty much we would switch to Jeff in like one minute. Then Jeff would actually talk to us about the project that he's doing. Then we would have a relatively short period of reflections and questions coming from our Ukrainian colleagues. And then we actually would go to like open Q&A, and then we would wrap up around 4 p.m. With those points in mind, it's really a great pleasure for me to actually introduce Jeff. So Jeff would be talking about archiving online evidence of human rights violations at the time of war, the case of the Syrian Archive, which is unfortunately extremely relevant and extremely timing, also in the context of what is going on right now in Ukraine. And Jeff is a director of operations and research at Mnemonic and co-founder of the Syrian Archive project, where he actually develops workflows and methodologies for open source investigations of human rights violations. Jeff has a doctorate from Humboldt University in Berlin and also is a fellow and member of the steering committee of the Center for Internet and Human Rights. So Jeff, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction and for having me. I would absolutely love to hear more about the different kinds of projects, the 2 or 3 different projects that were just mentioned. So I hope that there's like opportunity later in the conversation to talk about these things. Because as you mentioned, there's so much overlap. I mean, you know, some of the same tactics are being used, you know, in Ukraine as have been used in Syria. Some of the same weapons are being used, and sometimes it's the same people, right? So there's definitely like lots and lots of overlap. So what I can say is, from my side, I can introduce, you know, who I am and the organization, and give a couple of examples of maybe workflows and methods and tagging and stuff like this that are quite important and that I work on. I'm not a technologist myself, so I'm not a developer, but I can definitely point or steer into like some good people to talk to. And if there's specific follow-up questions relating to specific technology questions, I'm sure that like if we talk afterwards, then I can connect you to answer some of those things. I prepared a couple of slides, so I'll share these now. Let me see. Share screen. Very good. Can you all see this now?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'm coming from an organization called Mnemonic. We, as our mission, we work globally to help human rights defenders effectively use digital documentation of human rights violations and international crimes to support advocacy, justice, and accountability. And advocacy or justice, I mean, in many ways. So this means, for example, responding to requests from prosecutors. This means submitting content directly to war crimes units or to UN bodies or other intergovernmental groups, and advocacy as well. So sometimes maybe doing public campaigning for awareness, but sometimes speaking to governments or corporations in terms of trying to do different types of advocacy there. The project Syrian Archive, we started in 2014. And it was an initiative of 3 people, myself included, led by a Syrian national, Hadi Al-Khatib, which, like, you know, was just being described, was like a rapid response project. So we at the time were doing a lot of trainings, you know, with activists, human rights defenders, lawyers, mostly from MENA, so Middle East, North Africa, and primarily from Syria, who could leave the country at this time, but and then would go back and do reporting on crimes being committed. We were seeing in the case of Syria that there was like so much documentation being uploaded largely to social media platforms, primarily Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, but YouTube was a big one in the case of Syria. But we were seeing that a lot of this content was disappearing. So it was being taken down from flagging campaigns, coordinated flagging campaigns, you know, where groups would flag a video as violating terms of service. Groups had their accounts hacked into, all of the stuff deleted, or it was seized even before it was being uploaded, right, at a checkpoint or something like this, right? So we knew that we needed to develop a different type of infrastructure to store some of this content. And at first we did this quite manually. So we were individually downloading posts. This is, at almost 10 years ago, right? So things have changed a bit. But we really quickly realized that this is not sustainable. So we needed to learn to automate some of these processes. And we had a technologist, Nico, who was working on developing some of these tech tools for the automatic preservation. I was working on workflows, processes standardization. And then we, of course, had Hadi and his huge network of Syrians, both in country and in diaspora, who could be providing lists of sources, helping give contextual information. I mean, for those of you who are in the room, I mean, you might already have all of this, right? Because you're based in country, you have existing networks, all of this stuff. But we were at a different point. A couple of years later, 2017, 2018, we started thinking that we could use these technological like workflows, these infrastructures that we built up. We had no money at the beginning, and we were all working other jobs. We started to get a little bit in 2017 so that we could do this part-time, like, professionally. But we recognized that, we could use these kinds of methods, these kinds of tech infrastructure elsewhere. So we started working in Yemen. In 2018, we officially launched the Yemeni Archive, and Sudan in 2019. But for now, I'll focus on Syria as an example. They're very similar in terms of methodologies and workflows and infrastructures, but of course, they all take a slightly different form. Yemen, we're seeing much less documentation than Syria. Access is a huge issue. In Syria, everybody has a phone. There's stable internet. Like we're seeing now in Ukraine, right? Like a lot of documentation is coming out. So we do 4 main things, and I'm going to talk today mostly about the first, which is archiving. So archiving digital information to ensure that potential evidence is not lost and remains accessible and usable for future accountability groups, right, or advocacy. And I'll go into this a bit more. But we also do trainings. And so we've trained several thousand people over the last 8 years in multiple countries, on verification of audiovisual content, on discovery of content, on how to do archiving, right, and technical, like tech infrastructure, digital security, organizational security, trying to minimize some threats, that people might be facing in terms of doing this work. And then in terms of policy, because we've archived content, we have an exact record of what has been removed, right? We can check this and we know the context in which these posts had appeared. We know the titles of these videos. We know the comments that were in these videos. We know the descriptions of these videos. And so we can speak to, Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, and we can say, this is a mistake. This is important content. We can speak to governments and we can say, these laws will inadvertently remove this vital information. And so we do a lot of policy work using the content that we've archived, for the different projects. And then finally, this is more infrastructure, right? So we work on building and supporting open source tools and methods, specifically for the archiving or processing of open source content, right? Open source is the code is freely available, cheap, or free, right, in many cases. And we're working right now on building some tools that will, once they're stabilized, also be available for free. So some of the things that I'm talking about, will in a very, near future be also available for you all. But in terms of archiving, we focus on 3 things, right? We take a mass preservation approach, which differs maybe from some other organizations or approaches in the space. So some groups, for example, will say, we know there's a particular incident. We want to go out and we want to find content related specifically to this particular incident. And in our case, as I'll talk about maybe in a few minutes, we kind of take this collect all, never delete approach of, automatically on a daily basis, scraping this content, preserving it on different servers, because we don't know if it will be there tomorrow. right? Or next year or the year after. And if we have it within our systems, then we can always go back to it later. You know, we might not know what's potentially relevant until years later. We verify this content, so we try to preserve this content and also tag it according to admissibility standards. These differ because, you know, by jurisdiction, by country, by crime, you know, but we try. Specifically by using a set of data tags, so annotations like an ontology, so that we can search through the types of content that we have or share it, you know, and sort it. So I mean, some of you already talked about how you're using open source content or content from social media platforms. When we're talking about open source content, just so we're on the same page, you know, we're talking about publicly available information, you know, news, maps, satellite imagery, and social media. It's not like spying, you know, or covert surveillance or things like this. Most of the content that we have, like 95% or more, is open source content, publicly available information. We also get some direct submissions, as I'm sure you all do as well, but the majority is open source content. So open source investigations in general over the last 10 years or so have risen like crazy. You know, we see New York Times has this digital investigations team. BBC has a team as well, you know, here working on a story in Cameroon. And then, you know, within the NGO sector, groups like Amnesty and groups like Human Rights Watch as well, right? So this was from a project that we collaborated with Human Rights Watch on, looking specifically at the patterns in the use of chlorine attacks, right? I can't see any chat, so if there's anything coming through, I actually can't see it, just so you know. But we can definitely talk about this afterwards. Within the legal space, we're also seeing many developments. So here was the first arrest warrant for a Libyan national, Alvar Fali, in 2017. That was based primarily on Facebook content. So this was the first time we were seeing at the international level, international legal environment, you know, cases being brought primarily using open source content. This never actually was enacted, like the person died before justice could happen, but it was an important precedent, right? And I think we're going to be seeing that there's more and more opportunities for this type of, you know, things in the future. But there's a couple of problems with using open source content in general. The first, you know, is that the content is at risk of being removed, you know, or deleted. And this means both when it's uploaded, right, but also maybe later, right? Because we think like hard drives have an average lifespan of 7 years, you know. So we need to make sure that when we're preserving content and doing like long-term preservation, we're thinking not just in terms of having it on one hard drive, you know, but multiple hard drives, multiple servers, multiple places, you know, backed up, to outlive the life of any like, you know, single point of like failure, right? The second is, even if you have all of this content that's archived or preserved, let's say, verifying this content is like, it takes a lot of time. And this is time that maybe a lot of people don't have, right? So, but we need, you know, there's so much content that's being produced that we need to have kind of a standardized way of going through and doing verification. The third is, even if you have the stuff preserved, and even if you verified it, you need to make it searchable. And so with this, I mean, we're talking about ontologies, metadata schemas, tags, you know, ways of searching through the content so that you can find stuff later, basically. And I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a few. And the fourth, and specifically within a legal environment, is that this is largely untested, right? We haven't seen a huge number of cases that's based on using open source information yet. We know from transitional justice literature that having more participation, specifically from affected groups, right? Victims, survivors, family members, increases the legitimacy of any kind of accountability process that's going to happen. And we think that by using open source social media content, you know, this is a way of increasing public potential participation, right? We can take more content from more places. We can file more, introduce different types of cases, not limited to one specific kind of topic. But what we're seeing largely within an open source community or open source investigative community is that while the potential for this is very high, in practice, this isn't really happening, right? So we try to do this. Here's a visualization, right? Within an open source investigative space, we see, for example, there's all this stuff out here, and we try to narrow it down to get the perfect individual investigation, right? So hey, like, here's 5 videos talking about this one particular incident, right? And we see that as we narrow this down, you like reduce the amount of potential participation and the potential types of content that could be introduced, because you're looking only for the perfect thing, right? And we see that within a legal environment, it mirrors this, right? We see that like there's all these potential cases we can choose from, but we got to find the perfect one, right? So we're excluding all of these other less perfect cases, right? And this also reduces the number of cases you can do, the types of cases, etc. So in our work, one of our questions is how can we try to increase participation, to introduce more content, introduce more cases, to be as participatory as, unfortunately, the violations that we're seeing that are happening, right? And one of the ways that we do this is by taking what we call like a database-wide approach. We preserve content from a lot of places, but we don't always do, for example, just one-off investigations. We'll do big databases, thematic databases around a different topic. And I'll give an example of what this looks like in a few minutes. I can just, for example, I can say that we, for example, did a report that was targeting hospitals and medical facilities, right? A specifically protected person and object, according to like the law, right? So by looking at this at a wide scale, we can uncover, different patterns and trends and things that we wouldn't be able to do looking only at one individual investigation. So by scale and participation, like we did a data audit recently and found that we have, just with the content in Syria, over 40 years of footage, and I mean, across all of our archival projects, I think we have about 10 million records, right? For Syria, it's about 3.5 million, right? Already in Ukraine, because we are preserving content, we have about 500,000, right? So we're seeing the rate at which stuff is being uploaded is much faster than we were seeing in previous conflicts. I mean, tech has developed like crazy over the last 10 years. More people have phones, internet is faster. And infrastructure has developed in a way that we kind of didn't see before. But we're dealing with huge volumes of content that's largely visual and potentially has evidentiary value. As I mentioned, by scaling up, taking these big, database-wide approaches, we have the potential to increase the diversity of potential cases. We have filed a number of complaints in regards to Syria, for example, dealing with chemical attacks. We were the first organization to do so in collaboration with a couple of others in Germany. So this is under what was called universal jurisdiction, where if a crime is so grave, some countries can try these crimes nationally. We did subsequent filings in France and in Sweden, and recently submitted second submissions for these. But this is ICL. This is international criminal law, right? And even if, like, in the best case, this case is accepted, and in the best case, the documentation that we have is like admitted, and in the best case, we have a guilty verdict, right? This isn't justice for like the millions of people who have been affected, right? So there has to be other forms or ways in which we can potentially use some of this content outside of these individual case filings, right? And taking a scaled approach might allow for some of that. As I mentioned, it deals also with volume and variety of different data types, and also different cases, and scoping efficiency. So I'll talk about that in a second. There's 3 criteria that we try to do with the data. The first is to determine its potential usability. And by usability, what we mean is it admissible, or can it be admissible? We tried to follow what's called the Berkeley Protocol, which was published a year or two ago, put out by the Human Rights Center at Berkeley in collaboration, I think, with the UN Human Rights Council, but I might be wrong with this. So they set out like a set of standards for preservation, for processing, for verification. It's new, right? All this stuff is new. It hasn't been tried in you know, largely, but this is like the first attempt to kind of standardize to structure this. You know, we believe that if you can properly verify these records, they might be usable within a international criminal law framework. We do things like making confidence ratings for individual records, but also for sources. You know, are they reporting from the same place generally, right? Does it move around? Are they aggregating content? You know, we could look for things like watermarks, right? Does the watermark differ in each video? If so, maybe they're collecting and publishing different things, right? Or is it the same person you see in every video who's kind of going around? This differs by context, of course, you know, but there's ways of assessing for confidence. And then for usefulness, this is basically what can we see within this individual record, right? What can we directly observe? This is not in-depth analysis. This is not saying, for example, this is part of this larger incident, right? What this is saying is at an observation base, individual records, what can we directly see? You know, the weather, the date and the time, the location, right? Landmarks, maybe uniforms, maybe munitions. But we're really only describing what we see, or, you know, we're not doing any form of deeper analysis, right? And so then you get a base database, right? A baseline database just of the observations of individual records. We then make another database on top of this, which looks at its significance in context. So here we're saying, for example, taking an observation tag and then taking an incident tag and having the incident tags connect the different observation pieces, if that makes sense. So we can say, for example, these 5 videos belong to the same incident, right? They have the same characteristics of the same incident. So we have 2 different databases that are speaking to each other. You know, in terms of significance and context, by taking this at scale, right, we can tell stories that you can't tell by looking only at an individual incident or an individual record. You know, we can do things like looking at patterns, pattern analysis, you know, base crime patterns. Do we see, for example, hospitals being repeatedly targeted, right? Or schools being repeatedly targeted, or critical infrastructure being repeatedly targeted, right? You know, do we see particular use of munitions like over and over, right? Is this a one-off or is this part of a larger strategy, right? So taking a scaled up approach would allow for these kinds of things. We've been able to create certain indicators for things like looking at intent, which is very important if you're looking at an international criminal law framework. And I'll talk about those in a second. You can do things by doing a pattern analysis, like looking at, for example, proportionality. Is the weapons or strategy proportionate to the, you know, to the civilians or the threat that was faced? And you can always, you can also look for different types of less documented harms or crimes. You know, I mean, most of our content is open source. We have a large amount of content that's outside, much less that's inside. You have certain violations that are much more visible than others. Destruction of critical infrastructure being one of them, use of specific munitions being one of them. But things like sexual gender-based violence is not very well documented in the content that we have. But you might be able to have circumstantial indicators that could help with finding some of this, right? For example, if you're looking at a military base, there's been some research, for example, the BBC was doing into the investigation Cameron. They looked at this military base and they saw all of these women who were at these bases, right? And they weren't fighters. So the question is, why are they there? right? And maybe by adding up all of these different types of circumstantial indicators, you can say that the environment existed in which certain crimes were possible. And then if you find at a later point a specific example or specific case study, and you have the evidence to back this up, you can maybe say that this is part of a larger pattern, right? I mean, obviously it depends on the individual case. And of course, you can bring in different types of content, you know, as we were talking about, bringing in witness testimony and direct submissions and things like that, right? So to go back to this visualization we had, right, we're trying to expand the base a bit. We're trying to say that we can take this scaled up approach, both in our work, doing documentation, archiving, publishing of different types of content. It still reduces, you know, we have 10 million records. We haven't used, you know, anywhere near like half of them, right? But we can talk about or include different types of content that maybe don't meet the perfect standards within a legal environment, right? But still might have something that's useful. And we see that, you know, potentially in our work and maybe in the work that we're publishing, this might expand the types of cases or legal interventions that are maybe possible. So I'm going to talk about our data and operation model. I know this is kind of small, but I'm happy to send it afterwards, or it's available on our website as well. But it's a data and operational model, which I'm happy to go into in lots of detail, maybe during questions and answers. But basically, it's inspired by the electronic discovery reference model, which was built by or developed by Duke University School of Law. And it has different phases. The first being collection, where we create a list of sources that we want to collect content from. Types of mediums, right? So different social media platforms. Ontology, so this is like a metadata schema. How are we gonna organize our stuff? A preservation component, a processing component, verification. So this is like time, date, location, and then investigation, where you're doing more in-depth analysis, you know, of particular events. So I'm going to talk about one example of what this looks like with regards to our Syrian Archive project. You know, I mentioned we had this attacks against medical facilities database. We found documentation showing 410 different incidents, and we used a variety of circumstantial indicators to kind of narrow these down, and you can sort through them, right? So the website is there. It's medical.syrianarchive.org. All of the methods are there. All of the findings are there. And importantly, the tagging guide is there. So this is maybe like 60 pages or so. What are the ways in which we tag the content so that for this particular use case, we could use it as a case building tool set, right? We did things like, you know, adding indicators for whether it was known to parties, repeated attacks, clustered attacks, or whether it had other characteristics. And we found that if you added these together, you know, it created these like smaller circles of content. And from the total of 410 incidents, we had 374 incidents that showed some kind of characteristics of intentionality. Like, for example, for a hospital or for a medical facility, was this established prior to the conflict itself? You know, a lot of these have been. It was, you know, a functioning country with functioning medical system. You know, so it's the existence of these locations should have been known, or they were shared later, right, as part of a deconfliction mechanism. For characteristics of targeting, we had many. Here are some, like, for example, if it was directly hit, if there were, for example, what we would call double tap airstrikes, which in the Syrian context, it means different things in different contexts. So we also define this within a tagging guide. But within this context, it means, for example, if a location is hit, and then shortly thereafter, the same site is hit again, potentially targeting first responders, or the hospital where people are brought to, then this might be an indication that it was intentionally attacked. Whether there was multiple targeted strikes, whether it was remotely located, right? Some of these were very far from the front lines. There was nothing happening militarily around it. So you could maybe say that, you know, because it's far from the front lines, because it has no military, you know, connection, this might be another indicator, right? But of course, these have a confidence scale as well, right? And having one of these characteristics doesn't mean that it was intentional or that it was a strategy. But when you add them together, you know, it might make it easier to identify. Repeated attacks. Some of the facilities we saw were attacked many times. Like here, we see the same facility attacked 4 different times. And clustered. And what we meant here by clustered is not the use of cluster munitions, which I know are also being used in Ukraine. But what I mean is, for example, do we see several attacks within a small area within a particular time frame? So what we had to do then is, how do we define how big of an area, and how do we define a time frame? You know, if it's, you know, is it 1 day or is it like 1 hour? You know, so this is also something that should be considered. So this is kind of dealing with visual documentation, audio-visual user-generated content, but we also do work using other types of open source content, like trade data. So, for example, we filed these cases in France, Germany, and Sweden about chemical attacks in Syria. But we know that in 2013, after a very bad chemical attack in eastern Ghouta, the country of Syria signed the Convention Against the Use of Chemical Weapons. And so they, at the time, handed over all of their, or allegedly handed over all of their chemical weapons stockpiles and the precursors, and they were destroyed, apparently, right? But we know that there's been other chemical attacks since then. So the question is, how did they get their chemicals, or did they not destroy them all, right? And through looking at things like trade databases here, this is from Comtrade, which is a UN database of trade statistics, but most countries have national level trade statistics that you can find as well. This just aggregates them. We found that several countries continued to ship chemicals to Syria, including European countries, after export controls were put in place in 2013. In particular, we found this was the case in Belgium, where over 100 tons of isopropanol, like highly concentrated rubbing alcohol, which has a variety of industrial uses, but you needed to have like approval before sending this, right? They didn't get it, right? And so there was these parliamentary hearings, and a case was opened, and 3 firms were convicted because of export violations, you know, for not getting the right approval. There was also an internal audit of the Belgian customs system as a result of this, and a couple of other cases that were filed from regarding shipments from other countries, European countries, including via Switzerland. So at the time, for example, Switzerland wasn't subject to EU export controls of these chemicals because they're not an EU member state, but they changed this, right, as a result of this or similar investigations. And now this is no longer the case. So now they match up, right? It wasn't illegal before, now it potentially is, right? So there's a variety of very different types of ways of doing investigation, is all I'm saying. And there's ways that you can link them up to each other. I have 4 final thoughts about this, but you know, then I'm really hoping for this discussion to be like super interesting, because I know that you all have a huge amount of background as well. But the first thing is that behind all of this work is a real lot of very non-glamorous infrastructure work that has to go on. Like, as I mentioned, tools and hard drives break, you know, like hard drives every 7 years, but social media platforms also change the way that they're working, like all the time. You know, when we first started doing our work, Facebook, you could archive content very easily because they had what was called an API. Since that time, they removed this because of, I don't know if you all remember, but there was this scandal at Cambridge Analytica. And so this isn't possible anymore. So archiving content from there is much more difficult. And although we have some tools that can preserve this, we don't make these open source because then they won't work anymore, right? Tools like Telegram, I know was mentioned, right? Telegram also has an API, right? So you can also archive content from public groups on Telegram. But the important thing that I want to highlight here is that like a lot of the very impactful stuff like is just maintenance and like boring improvements and making sure that stuff, you know, continues to work, right? You're not, if it continues to work, you see no impact basically, but it's vitally important. So the second thing, there's a lot of interest right now in end money, I would say, you know, in trying to support, you know, documentation efforts, you know, accountability efforts. There, as opposed to 10 years ago, there's a lot of tools now that already exist. You know, nobody has to reinvent the wheel. You know, collaboration is great. Working with a lot of groups, you know, who are already working on this, whether these be large NGOs or whether these be like, you know, small tech companies, you know, focus on collaborating with other groups, even if not everything lines up exactly, you know, the politics between different organizations, which was the case when we first started in Syria, but now has become much less so. Right now, there's a lot more collaboration. There's a lot of money and hype going into things like AI and machine learning. We have been working since 2017 on trying to get machine learning working, and we're just starting to see results, right? It's taken like 5 years. There's some models that exist for some objects like cars and people and, you know, stuff like this. But for a lot of the stuff that we're looking for, there isn't, you know, like things like weapons or munitions or things like this, right? So we had to build them ourselves, and it's just starting to find some of the things. So don't go for the newest stuff, right? Is all I'm saying. Also, there's limited resources, and now it's getting harder and harder because like the economy in the whole world is collapsing, right? Foundations have less money, and so I think working together is more important than ever before. You know, there's too much work for any one person or organization. The third thing is that not all of our work or any group's work is high impact. Like we have had like very big impact in terms of Belgian companies being found guilty or Swiss law changes, right? But there's many things that we have done that haven't been successful in the court of law or elsewhere, such as filing other submissions regarding other exports. And then the last is that this work is really long term, and we're not going to be seeing changes like overnight. You know, when we started, there were no accountability or international accountability mechanisms for Syria. That changed. There's now what's called the IIIM, like Independent and Impartial Investigative Mechanism, which collects evidence, documentation, prepares cases, and then national level prosecutors can ask them for content. But that's because there was no ICC mandate. There was no International Criminal Court mandate. In the case of Yemen, there was a mechanism called the Group of Eminent Experts. And then under pressure from Saudi Arabia and Emirates, their mandate was revoked. And this doesn't exist anymore. So that means the groups that were submitting content to them, like they have to hold on to this stuff because there's no mechanism right now in place. And, you know, this is, you know, for many groups like ours, we have to hold on to this content for a very, very long time. You know, when you're working on developing your own projects, I think it's very important to think of how this data can outlive us as people and as an organization. You know, if we lose funding, then we have to figure out who's going to own it, right? And how things can go beyond this. Yeah, so in the meantime, right, this means that there's a lot of support that's needed to maintain all of the stuff so it doesn't break, you know, which means for the next 10, 20 years. So think about the tech tools that you're using, the infrastructure, but also think about tags and how you're going to be annotating some of the content so that it can be understandable like 10, 20 years into the future, you know. A lot of our work is coming from experiences speaking to Holocaust institutions, you know, from the Second World War. They didn't have social media content, but they had a lot of stuff and papers, and you know how they were sorting their stuff is very similar to how we're looking to store ours. So I'll stop there, but I'm super looking forward to questions, discussions, and hearing more about all the work that you guys are doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It was really fabulous talk, and I'm sure that we're definitely having a lot of things to discuss. I personally really having a lot of questions, but I will actually shift the floor to Taras and Bogdan team, and then we would actually have an open Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Jeff, for this wonderful talk about your project, and actually it resonates a lot. Basically, nearly in everything that you've done with this project, we are. It is simply relevant to what we do in most cases with our Telegram archiving initiative. Maybe. I also will mention a few words about that, just to give you the context of what we're doing. But in general, your idea that you mentioned about archiving for a long-term perspective is something that we initially do. And maybe this is something that on one hand makes our project similar, but also differs here a bit, because what you do, as far as I understand, with this project is rather documenting human rights violations and doing investigation on that for legal further procedures primarily. With the project that we are doing at the moment with Telegram Archive is not directly about crimes against humanity and documentation of that for legal proceedings, but as a historical institution, Center for Urban History, the institution I work at, and this in general, this archiving initiative is affiliated to, is rather about creating an archive, historical archive, based on social media material as a part of the general archive that will be available in a long-term perspective, basically. And as you mentioned, a lot of stuff from social media is very often deleted or disappearing or getting messy or unstructured because of all contents changes and updates by social media platforms. So this was one of the reasons why we decided to collect this, so that in a horizon of 50 or 100 years even, it still will be a historical source, archival source that it will be possible to use. So for that is why it is important for us not only archive it, but also not only to store and preserve these materials, but also to create an archival setting for that, so that all the provenance and credibility of the sources is adhered and preserved. And in that sense, we also try to archive not a specific content, not a specific video or image, but social media flow as it is. So basically all the content that is present in a specific channel or chat in Telegram, we try to collect and preserve it entirely. And this is done in order to make it visible and understandable in the context, how this certain image or certain video was posted, where it was posted, and how it looks in this flow perspective or landscape perspective, social media landscape. I'm not sure if I have a right term for that. And we also do that, we started doing this manually. So we didn't have some automatized scripts or algorithms how to collect this data. And we are lucky that the Telegram allows it basically to save chat channels history manually. So we were able to just collect these materials and save it. And here we are basically at the moment when we started dealing with a lot of those questions on public or private, how to create a metadata schema or ontology for that. And these are like my questions to your presentation. Maybe we can go deeper into that. You mentioned it already in your presentation, and maybe we can go deeper into into this definition of open source data, because you mentioned that everything that was published online on the social media, we can define as open source. And we basically have the same question with the material that we collect. We try to collect only those channels or chat that are publicly available, because in Telegram it is possible to have private messaging, private chats that we do not basically collect because we consider it as a private thing. But everything that is publicly available, we decided that this is something that it is possible to collect and store. And we still have questions and concerns about that, because sometimes we have publicly available channels where there is a lot of personal identifiable information about people posting messages there, their names, their phone numbers, their dates of birth, places of residences, very like direct in personal data, personal information that we are a bit worrying about. We are not sure if it's well, worth collecting or how to preserve it in order to not make it available for third parties from our archive. At the same time, there are private I think it is private, still private messages, information in those chats, maybe that are not directly about the person, but there are chats where people like discuss their personal emotional experiences going through this war, or even cases that could be qualified as crimes against humanity, and all those horrible stuff that is happening, and people share it there. Probably they make it publicly available by sharing it there, but I still sometimes think that it's something that might be not worth sharing or not worth making publicly available. For instance, there is a chat where people mention about their psychological difficulties while going through this war, and they are in a very vulnerable position by posting these messages there. They do not post it because they want to post it there, but they are seeking for help, basically. And I'm not sure what to do with this kind of content. Is it private or it public? How we define this boundary between private and public in social media? So this is one question about this kind of stuff. And there is also legal and copyright issues. I'm not sure if there are issues all the time, but sometimes there is a content that basically is not possible to define the copyright or authorship of the content. How do you deal with this matter of copyright and authorship in general? Is it somehow does it apply to your archive, to your project? And also, do you think about, I don't know, any possibility of consent for the authors of this content? For instance, if someone posted some material and it is preserved in your collection, whether the author of this material, the one who generated this content, published it online, aware of this material being preserved in your archive or not? And whether there is a possibility to withdraw it from your collection somehow. And yeah, and there's another part about this processing, maintenance that you mentioned. It is actually really, really a good point to think about this maintenance, and sometimes really long time and boring stuff of working on structuring, processing these materials and how to do that. And I'm actually really curious to learn about your ontology and tagging methodology. How do you created it? Was it originally created specifically for your archive, or you learn about some other projects that helped you to create this ontology? And also the software, because you mentioned a very good point about collaboration over innovation. I totally agree with that. We should work more on collaborative solutions for this kind of projects instead of instead of developing new tools and software for this kind of archive. And we actually, at the moment, were thinking how to proceed with the content that we collected, because as I mentioned, we collected it manually, and it is basically over 3 terabytes of data at the moment. I'm not sure how many videos do we have, because as I mentioned, we collect flows, and there is everything: videos, photos, messages, data files, anything. And we have this more than 3 terabytes of data. We have it in a format, as Telegram allows it to save. We have it in a format of HTML files with the corresponding media files linked to this HTML files. So each channel or chat from Telegram is saved as a specific HTML file, and there are folders with media files related to this HTML file. There is also another opportunity to save it in JSON format, but we started with HTML, and we basically decided that it will allow us to work with this material as a human readable format, so we can read it, not only for machines, but also for people. But at the same time, as I've been trying to learn web archiving practices, and in web archiving methodology, HTML is more common, more present format to same material, because that it is also possible to convert, to transform this HTML files into WARC formats, WARC format. So basically, by having this material collected in this format, we have opportunity to convert it into web archiving formats, and then use the software that is already available for this kind of files and this kind of archives. That is, well, this was one of the strategies for us. But at the same time, I'm just trying to mention it in order to ask you about the software that you use, because there is another solution or another strategy that we might go deeper in, is that the Telegram itself allows you to, it is open source code of the software of the Telegram application is open source. So we were also thinking maybe it makes sense to take it and basically create an archival setting with the interface that is directly the same as the Telegram, but only for the material that we preserved and collected. And in that sense, we create an interface that gives you the context of how this content was generated. So it's not only about the content, but also about the interface for the archiving purpose, for using it as not only like evidence material, but also historical sources, archival sources that will be available for scholarship in the future. It might be useful to have this interface as well. But at the same time, we are at the moment where we're thinking how to process all this material, all the 3 terabytes of data with some kind of software. Now we just have files, and now we need to understand how to basically maintain this awful lot of amount of content. And now I would be really curious to learn more about the software that you use for storing all those files, for tagging them. You mentioned that you develop several relational databases in order to tag all the content and materials. So it would be interesting to learn more about that. I have some other questions, but probably I'm talking too long, and probably I should stop here to listen about your your commentary on that. Thank you again for your presentation.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Tars. And maybe I'll start with the last one. So HTML is used for archiving some things, right? But JSON is used as the way generally of the databases being like speaking to each other and structuring it. We have a MongoDB database, so JSON is able to speak to this quite easily. The software that we have, so several years ago, we worked on developing a software. We had a person who was working with this that was called SugarCube at the time. it's changed significantly since then, right? So the code for this is available, but in an earlier version. We're in a process of updating, stabilizing, testing everything. Once this is done, we're definitely going to be releasing this, right, as free and open source software. So the way this basically works is you have a hub that is like the Sugar Cube hub, and you have different plugins. So you have a Facebook plugin, Telegram, YouTube, whatever, and they all speak to each other. You also have a plugin for the ontology, the metadata schema. And so you can use the same thing to basically sort different pieces of content according to different schemas, right? Maybe we, for example, every time we do a big database, we have a slightly different schema, right? So, because we have like a unstructured data approach, you can go back, you can add more fields later. You don't have to start from the beginning, right? You don't have to, at the very beginning, say, these are my 20 categories and that's it, right? And you can always go back and you can add more. We have hundreds of tags, for records, right? And sometimes some of them are technical, like file size, date of creation, date of upload, title, description, user, right? Some of them are not, and some of those are basically researchers going in and tagging things according to specific fields. So this maybe speaks to one of the other questions that you had on ontologies, right? When we started, we had a variety of purposes. One was potential like legal cases, but largely it was awareness and a memory, a potential use case. At the time, this was like people wanted to get stories out of what was happening. It was a closed society. There was no foreign journalists. There was like no international NGOs. UN wasn't even allowed to go in, right? And with certain exceptions. So really getting the stories out about what was happening was key, right? And so investigations and publishing investigations about particular incidents that were accessible, I think was kind of core to this. There's another project that we're working on, which is like an oral history project as well. Because right now we have largely crime-based footage, which is an attack has happened, the immediate aftermath, or the attack that's actually going on, right? Sometimes you'll see a plane overhead and then dropping something, right? But what you don't really have in here is the people who are filming and like the people behind the cameras. And so we're in a process of also working on getting their stories and trying to talk about, how did they become involved in this? Where did they go? What do they do? It's not exactly one-to-one for what you were saying, but it's like, there is this, I think, historical component as well, largely because we were seeing so much misinformation coming out and trying to set a record of like, no, this happened, right? And here's how, and here's why, right? There was so much misinformation, so much propaganda that, trying to get into the public record, like, this is important, right? As part of that, we also wanted to speak to, for example, the Commission of Inquiry for Syria and others for other countries, so that they could publish the fact that these things happened, and it could be like established that in institutional memory that these events or experiences have taken place. It was only much later that we started to engage in the legal setting, because there was no cases, for many years. I mean, we filed the first complaint 2018, so we have been doing work for 4 years before there was any complaint. But we still tried to preserve it so that it potentially could be used for them, like purpose later, right? This is things like when we preserve it, hashing and timestamping the content. I don't know if this is a common, something that, maybe I'll just explain it. Okay, so hashing is like you have an equation that you apply to a particular piece of content, and you get a unique code as a result of it. There's two main different types. One is called an MD5, and one is called a SHA-256. You just get a random code with numbers and letters, and it's unique to the piece of content that you have and the original, or original metadata that you have with it, the title, the creator, what have you. The time and we partnered with an organization called Inigio, which is based in Canada. I think their main clients are banks, right? Because this is a blockchain thing. Blockchain is ledgers. This is a real blockchain like use case. You know, we want the ledger of what do we have and when did we have it. And then we know that like if somebody wants to potentially in the future use some of the content that we've had in a legal case, there's at least an independent record that has like, you know, that shows that we haven't tampered with it, because you can compare the codes and they should be the same code. If we edited the content and like added more fields and things, or edited the video, right, then it wouldn't have the same code, right? So this is something that you can automate in when you're preserving it. I don't know if you've moved on from manually doing it or if you're still manually, okay, totally fine. There's probably ways of also building this in, and it depends on how many sources you have. There are some tools available for doing things on like a single channel basis already. I know for YouTube and some other pages. I'm not sure for Telegram, but I can look into it. The hard thing about automation, I mean, because we're dealing with thousands of things a day, like we couldn't do this like individually, and so we wanted to automate it. But you also need to then have a system administrator. You need to have tech people who are doing all of this stuff, and that's time and money, right? And skill sets, and it's hard, right? So it really depends. I mean, there's a lot of groups who are also already working on preserving of different types of content. In Ukraine also, we are working with a number of groups right now who are submitting content to us for preservation, so that, you know, at least there's a record. And then, you know, we're building in potential for like future access, you know, of content that people have submitted. I'm not the person who's leading on this, but I can definitely, like, we can, you know, talk afterwards and try to make something happen. Consent. So we have built partnership agreements with many media houses in the Syrian context. And when we were working, this is largely because people who are working on Syria are from Syria, and they had existing relationships with people, with groups, you know, with documentation efforts. And, you know, because people knew each other, they could just be asked, you know, can we do this? In not all cases, like we don't have this for all cases, you know, we in Syrian context, we're archiving content from Russian Ministry of Defense. We're not getting permission, right? But maybe this is content that would be perpetrator content, dropping a bomb from a plane, right? It's still publicly available information, some of which is taken down, right? So this is important. So in 2017, when we noticed we were putting in footnotes into a report on an earlier version, our first report on hospitals and medical facilities, and putting in the citation, saw that all of the links were down, you know, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, like all of a sudden, randomly. And we found that platforms were largely under pressure from Western governments, Europeans, Australians, US, trying to remove terrorist, violent, extremist contents at scale. And they were using machine learning to do it. It was enacted very poorly, largely affecting like human rights documentation in Middle East, North Africa, much less so with white supremacy in the US, for example, right? So it was like enacted very unequally for a number of reasons, but they improved it since. They added in human reviewers. You know, the takedowns, we see the rates have been lowered, jumping again during COVID because nobody could work in these like content moderation warehouses, you know, reviewing stuff. But anyway, so at the time, 2017, we put a call out to, you know, using our pages to see if people were also affected by these changes. And we had an overwhelming response. We had at the time maybe 1,000 sources. It jumped to 5,000 in a month, because people wrote us saying, yes, I've been affected, or no, I haven't, but I would like to have my stuff preserved. And we also had consent forms built into this. So can we use this for XYZ purpose? And in many cases, we got this, right? So we don't have for every channel, but we have for many. And this isn't the case of Syria. In Yemen, it took a year of working on trainings and network building before we were able to officially launch, because access was much different. Documentation was much different. The types of content coming out were much different. You weren't seeing as much on video because network bandwidth was slower. You know, Yemen has more internet outages than any country in the region. But we were seeing text-based stuff, you know, tweets, stuff like this. Part of this training was also making partnership agreements with many groups. Of course, we don't have this for all cases, but you know, that was definitely the case there for some. But in terms of the possibility of withdrawing, we regularly get requests from people. Maybe they're not a person filming, but maybe they're seen in documentation that we have made public as a result of an investigation. And we get two types. One, this video is still online on YouTube, let's say. Can you take it down? Because we have connections to social media, we can do that. And they've been great about this. So every time we write YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, they take a piece of content down that maybe shouldn't be there. But you know, we make sure that we have it first, and that, you know, that it's somewhere. So if we get a request to take down content that we've publicly shown, then we'll comply with that. You know, if it's a person who's let's say in a video footage, and let's say the area of control has changed and it's become not safe anymore to have a person visible when it was, I don't know, a year ago or 6 months ago or something, right? But we won't delete the record from our system. So we'll still have it stored, we just won't have it public. Yeah, so I hope that kind of answers that a little bit. In terms of copyright, yeah, so we have, I mean, the original creator, you know, is always recorded. With the partnership agreements, then, like, you know, they're always credited, but you know, we've tried to address this, you know, to a certain extent. But again, not with everything. And it's tricky when you're dealing with issues of consent and potential perpetrator footage. You know, people don't want to, of course, consent to having documentation that they film themselves uploading, you know, dropping a bomb on a school. You know, maybe they wouldn't consent to having that being stored by us. But I guess you have to weigh the public interest, you know, versus the potential threat. And there's not like a yes or no answer to this. If that makes sense. I'm not sure, like, in terms of your projects, like, have you already started to upload stuff into a platform, or is this something you're still in the early stages of doing or thinking about? Or
we're actually only collecting at the moment because of all those concerns that we have. We decided that we do not make any of it anyhow public to the general audience before we define our methodology on making it public, before defining all the protocols about that, before defining the software solution about that.
I would also add that, like, typically in an open source investigation, you want to publish not only the source material, but also the methods by which you did verification, right? So that it could be repeated. So people can go back and they can redo it if the research themselves, right? Sometimes we don't publish all of this information. If it's a direct submission, we don't publish it. If it's from a you know, private group or channel or something like this, we don't. Especially if we're engaged in legal cases or potential perpetrator footage, you know, maybe some of this is on private groups. You know, we don't want them to know that we're collecting some of this information, right? But for example, going back to hospitals and medical facilities, although these coordinates were clearly known because they've been repeatedly attacked, we didn't publish the coordinates. And anything that was published was like a bit off, right? That was published publicly, right? If this is shared privately to like a prosecutor, for example, this is a different story. You know, witness interviews, these are never made public, for example. But in terms of consent, I mean, like there are procedures that are in place for doing witness interviews, exploratory interviews. Unless you're specifically trained in doing so, I would recommend not doing that because some people have spoken to many different people about a particular incident. And if you do, right, every time somebody speaks, their story changes a little bit, right? And if they speak multiple times, and then, you know, potentially collecting this for potential legal cases or something later, you know, you could inadvertently be like, in an attempt to highlight something has happened, like potentially avoiding some kind of use of this person for accountability purposes later on, if that makes sense. Yeah. Did I answer most of your questions, or were there any things that?
No, you did. You did. Thank you. Yeah. I'd probably give Dan wants to.
Not that we're sort of on that sophisticated level as your project, and probably it's also because of a different team structure and how you initiate such projects. So to tell you some background, the Center for Urban History is a private institution, and that's why it can embark on such projects, but it has very limited resources. We have like one person who is responsible for, let's say, media archiving. This is Taras. I do a project with students. Our colleague Natalia works with oral testimonies. And we don't really have even time to think about the future of these archives. So mainly is the purpose to collect and make these databases. And my question to you is, basically, how do you start it? How does it look like? I mean, the core group, and then how you develop now? Is it your like 24 hours work now, or you also have some private, sorry, life? I'm joking about private, but life, yeah. And I've seen on your webpage you even received the Ars Electronica honorary mention. How does this happen? So tell us more about the and your networking model. I see a lot of groups involved, organizations. How do you actually do this? Since I think it might be actual for our proceedings in the future.
Great question. I actually had the same question about, is it your full-time thing?
Yeah, no, these are all like excellent questions. So what I can say is when we started, it absolutely was not. I mean, we all had side jobs, you know, to make money because we had no money coming into this. We were at some point able to have it be the main jobs for 3 people, but it took a couple of years. Now we have grown. We have like 40 people in 8 different countries. 9 different countries. It was very hard to get funding at first. Now there's maybe 10 different funders. You know, it varies from 10,000 to, you know, something that's, you know, multi-year or something. But this took a long, long time. Because I think also years ago it falls in an interesting space. There's a tech on the one side, there's a country specific on the other. And there are people who are interested in tech, and there's people who are interested in Syria, right? Now this connection is made. You know, people understand that these issues are connected, right? For Ukraine, for example, like everybody can see everything that's happening, right? But at the time, this was not the case. There is some small funding I know from different foundations. Our first funding came from a group called Prototype Fund, which was through the Open Knowledge Foundation. For this, you have to have a person connected to Germany somehow, like in Germany, but that's it, right? You don't need to be a citizen. You don't need to like whatever. We just recently got funding from the European AI Fund, which is helping support some of our policy work. they will soon have another call for applications, and they don't want anyone who has it, right? So it'll be brand new people. This is a place to look into EU AI fund, you know, to maybe like fund specific kind of aspects. But how it started, I suppose there was like a researcher, right? Me, there was a technologist, and then there was a person who was basically doing community outreach and network building, right, as well as verification. Now, most of the people who are working on a specific project, let's say Syrian Archive team, you know, we will have many people who are just doing verification of content or tagging of content. We'll have a separate technology team, you know, that's only maintaining the tech stuff. You know, or building an interface, which is something that, you know, we've been working on. There's a couple tools that exist for interface stuff already. This organization Holocaust in Switzerland, I think, has developed some case. I forget what it's called, case builder, case manager, something like this. This is free and open source to a certain extent. So this maybe isn't the perfect solution, but it's a solution. They have another tool called Uwazi, UWAZI, which is also free and open source to a certain extent, depending on if you want to host it on your own stuff or if you want to host it on their stuff. And I think they also do things like helping build custom models. So for the free or cheap stuff that exists right now, I would say this is probably a good thing to explore, or you can have a conversation with them. In terms of, okay, so how do we do community outreach? We have a dedicated person per project doing community outreach. So for Yemen, we have a dedicated person who's only reaching out to groups or people, right? Building up relationships, making agreements, partnership agreements for Syria as well. And that's their whole job, you know. We have another person, Jalud, who knows many people. So through personal connections that already exist, or then kind of framing this and pushing this through to the dedicated community organizing people that we have on staff. How do we store it? I mean, it really varies by type of data. You know, sometimes it's HTML, right? Like you guys are doing. Sometimes it's like stored as JSON stuff, you know, JSON files, and then converted into like or imported into like a MongoDB database. The interface that we're working on right now, which once it's stable, I think, you know, we'll also be releasing, you know, for free, would be would allow you to archive content, access content that's archived, annotate content, build annotation fields, you know, the whole kind of thing. There's some tools that already do this for smaller data sets. Check is one of them, developed by an organization called Medan. I don't know if they have a Telegram tool for this, but they might. It's worth looking into. Invid is another, developed by Deutsche Welle. I think their main users are media houses, right? Or media production, like I don't know. For example, AP. I'm not saying AP is doing it, but you know, like big media houses, because we have to think of this type of content as a media library like stuff. You know, it's not just for documentation. You're dealing with large scale amounts of media content. You need a media library. There's commercial software that exists, but it's really expensive usually. It's really good, but it's expensive, right? So it depends on what the budget is, because I think if you have the means to maybe do a commercial software right now, it might be the fastest and easiest option. But I think, I mean, last time I checked, they're like 10,000 or something per year. You know, they're expensive, but you then don't have to build a tech team, you know, because maybe it's cheaper to pay 10,000 for a license than to pay 2 tech people a salary for a year, you know. And you'll get maintenance, you'll get a custom tool, you know, for you. So there's a couple things like this. In terms of open source, I haven't seen too much beyond like Uwazi, Czech, right now that exist. In terms of Ars Electronica, so this happened because of the machine learning stuff that we're doing. So we have been working to develop models for searching through these millions of records. And this was for a project that we collaborated with on with an artist named Adam Harvey on a software called VFrame. And so this is specifically looking at cluster munitions, some of which are also the same ones being used in Ukraine, unfortunately, where you have like a large container, it opens up and you have smaller, munitions that are falling out. I think my mic just disconnected. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. Okay. So this was for kind of this workflow and the process, creating these 3D models as objects that we could search for, which took a long time. There weren't existing libraries for this. It's, as I mentioned, it's just starting to work. So like this year, we're working on developing a database on cluster munition attacks for a couple of different types of munitions. And we're finding new content that we hadn't known that we had before, that we've owned for years, So this was I suppose for the R's. Does that answer the question, or am I missing something? Very good.
Thank you.
Excellent. Then I guess that we are kind of done with the questions from the side of the urban history team. Then I guess we can just open the floor for kind of everyone's questions. Do we have other questions? Because I definitely got quite some. So. Okay, so I kind of see
from you, yeah.
Yeah. I guess I will just go with my questions, and probably some people will jump in. So I have, I think, let me see, Jeff. I would say that probably 2 questions I would start with. Because I'm really on the side of the fancy things like the machine learning and AI, can you also tell a bit more about how you would see the future uses of those for the Syrian Archive? So do you have any kind of ideas what you actually would like to use them in the long perspective? And what are the main issues you're dealing with? Because, okay, one of them is pretty obvious. We really find kind of lacking the good, I would say, recognition libraries for doing things which are not very basic, like the machines, so let's say the human faces. But are there any additional challenges you can think about? And my second question is about the users of the Syrian Archive by let's say, third external parties. Can you actually tell a bit more about what kind of experiences do you actually have with some people potentially coming to you and telling, okay, we would like to use the data for this, and this, and how you're actually seeing the potential users again in the longer perspective? So what you would say would be the users in like 5 or 10 years from now? I would really love to hear some of your ideas on those two.
Perfect. Maybe I'll start with the uses by external parties. So we get a lot of requests for using our stuff. So, I mean, a lot of things we post publicly. So things that we can verify time, date, location, and which are public, we post. And then what people do with that, we're not entirely sure. But we also get requests for particular data sets for things that we haven't published. We get requests from, I mean, increasingly we're getting requests from legal authorities, prosecutors, war crimes units to put together a list of individual records or an incident report of what has happened where. But this is relatively new. So maybe it used to be 1 a year. This year we have 30 already, right? So it's so we need to have a dedicated legal team to do this, right? We have 1 lawyer who's working with the teams on putting this together. 1.5, we have 1 part-time person. For Yemen, we were also, same kind of story. Nobody from legal authorities cared for a long time, and then we were all of a sudden getting requests. Now there's no legal requests anymore because there's no accountability mechanisms in place. But we do get media requests quite often for both, you know, so news media asking for particular pieces of content, or if we have any information about particular events. And we kind of have to do these on a case-by-case basis. One based on, I mean, if we have the capacity as a team to even respond to it, which in most cases we don't. You know, sometimes we do. So then it's, okay, do we have it? Can we search through and can we find if we have any content? And then I guess the third aspect is like, is this something that we feel that we can even share? You know, so again, this really depends on a case-by-case basis. From academia, much less so. So we get a lot of requests from various academic groups. We don't currently have the capacity to respond to most of them, you know. I don't remember the last time we did, you know, and just because, I mean, for things that are already publicly available, I think this is fine, you know, to be using, but to, you know, we don't have enough manpower, like we don't have enough like staff time to basically just respond to requests from academia. And sometimes they were just asking for too much stuff, you know, like everything. They would say, can you give us all of your stuff? Maybe you're laughing because you have similar experiences. I'm not sure. But that's kind of crazy. Like, I don't think we should hand everything over. You know, I think we can make it a bit more limited. And sometimes if we do have something that's more limited, we do so. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I say this as a PhD person, right? So like, I get it, you know. We've collaborated a lot with universities. Berkeley, Human Rights Center at Berkeley. They're great. They have a really good team of student volunteers with the Human Rights Center. So obviously, if we're partnering on a project or something, then we can share more stuff with them, and maybe they can give more information. We've collaborated with others. I think at Cambridge, they also have or at least they used to have a digital verification core unit set up from Amnesty International, who had these different teams of students at different universities. We used to engage with them a lot more than we do now, especially when we were first getting set up. So at Cambridge, Toronto also has a digital verification core. Essex University in the UK has one. Who else? Yeah, I'll have to think of it. But there used to be one in Hong Kong, not anymore. But there's all these students who are working with us and many others on trying to verify content, like increase the capacity of the stuff that we have. And for this, like we would share many things, right? So it depends if it's a one-way thing or if it's something that we're both kind of benefiting from. Yeah, I hope that answers the uses question a little bit. Machine learning, AI, and future uses. You mentioned in your question that faces are easy to detect, and this is actually really funny because you have like we were trying for a long time to make a face blurring tool for blurring faces that we publish publicly, but also for things that we haven't published to make it easier for the researchers, because I mean, the material is like horrible, right? As you all know. And if you maybe take out the faces, it becomes a little bit easier to deal with, right? You know, we've done things like from our side, putting things in grayscale by default, right? So taking out the color just so that it's like you have to really click through it to try to find this stuff. You know, taking out the sound by default, right? So that you don't have to hear everything, right? You know, trying to have psychosocial care therapists for staff members, right? So this should definitely be part of any funding model, I think, that you're putting together. But like a lot of the jobs, like it sucks, you know, like it's material that's like, you know, it sucks. So, but faces, right? So for faces, to make a detector, you need to know what is a face, right? And if I'm looking at you all straight forward, right, then you have the two eyes and nose and a mouth. But if a person is laying on the ground upside down, then you don't see their face necessarily, right? And so would this be blurred, or would this be like a head detector, right? If somebody is like a victim of an attack and they have an oxygen mask, then it maybe looks very different than you know, us looking at each other right now. So it was really hard, and it didn't really work so well. We also worked with Adam and VFrame on trying to do this, and it hasn't been totally implemented yet. It needs more work, and it needs more funding. Most of the face detectors are based on Flickr images, right, of celebrities, actually, right? So then you have to think, who's a celebrity, right? And what kinds of faces do they have? And then you'll maybe be detecting some things, but maybe in the Syrian context, a little bit less, right? So it hasn't been totally straightforward. But so for right now, for the machine learning, like we'd like to do this cluster munition database as a trial. So we built up a couple of different detectors for both the containers and the submunitions, because as I'm sure you all know, they don't always explode. And you sometimes find these remnants after, right? Or unexploded submunitions. So this is the plan for now. But really, I mean, then the possibilities are like endless, you know, like there's some models that are already available for free and you can just use them. Cars work, you know, this is great, but planes also. I mean, there's a lot of footage that we have of people like filming up, right? So you don't have any landmark, but maybe you can, like, the underside of a plane is a unique shape, right? Sometimes or a helicopter, right? And so this is something that we're definitely looking into a bit, because maybe particular planes are used by certain forces and other planes are used by others, or helicopters or what have you. But then, I mean, really just like, we would like to use the existing models to add a tag to pieces of content with basically the probability of a particular object appearing in it. And then we can search through it, and we can maybe, you know, 5 years from now or something, say we want to do something on this, search through the stuff and see what kind of comes out with a potential positive hit. You know, machine learning is, it doesn't say yes or no, it says like 70% probability that something is here or not. So in the short term, I think just putting this one report out, but then, you know, potentially using some of these models, both in terms of the stuff that we've already archived, but, you know, also maybe elsewhere. I mean, like some of the same munitions are being used in multiple countries. It might be possible to be already using tools that we developed for Syria in Ukraine, for example, already using stuff from Yemen in Sudan, you know, where you have like overlap, right? But we'll see, you know, like it depends on capacity and if things work or not. It took 5 years to get it working to the point it is now. What are your guys' ideas on this?
Yeah, I can just say on my side that I really think it's fascinating, Jeff. I really would be so happy if you'd actually release the trained models, because I totally see how they can be reused, especially considering that it's sad, but Russia is involved in a bit too many conflicts, and we expect that it probably would be involved in more potentially in the future. And then indeed we can basically just take the model and then apply it to the data, because I totally agree that, okay, machine learning is never perfect. You're always operating with probabilities, but still it can be really fascinating things to share with the community. So I would say if you would have something to share, I would be really so happy to actually see it being shared at some point.
We definitely plan to share them, you know, like so they can be available for everyone, you know. Yeah, there isn't an interface right now, so we had to build an interface to use it. But I mean, if you can use Terminal or something like this, which you're going to be using for machine learning anyway, then you will be able to use it for sure as soon as it's stabilized and done this year, you know.
Wait, do we have more questions for Jeff?
that we will follow Jeff your development, and you, since 5 years of development makes me suffer even mentally. And yeah, it would be better to follow and use ready-made examples. Yeah, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, I might have a small question on the topic that you mentioned at the end of your talk about the Holocaust scholarship methodology that somehow helped you or was in use while structuring the archive you are working on. Because, well, the Center for Urban History, among other things, is also partnering with the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure in some projects. And we are actually organizing a methodological seminar this year where we would like to discuss this topic, how the Holocaust studies, Holocaust scholarship is affected, or Holocaust scholarship in Ukraine is also affected by the experience of going through the current war, and how it also, like the methodology of from Holocaust studies, how it allows us, how it helps us to work with the study of, well, of this war. So just you mentioned it briefly, so maybe you can say a few words more about that. I'm basically curious about that.
Yeah, that's a super good question. We spoke mostly with an institute based in Amsterdam called NIAD, which is the Institute for, you know, I mean, you're saying, you're smiling, so I know that you know them. They actually have a conference on this week in Amsterdam, which I'm not part of, but I know many people who are. It's mostly academic.
We are.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, then great. Good luck. I hope you're going to Amsterdam in person, or are you going to be joining virtually, or?
No, the colleague of mine, the director of the institution, actually is going there, but okay. I'm not allowed to leave the country at all.
Yes, so, yes. Okay. Yeah, I mean, like, so they're great. I mean, I would definitely get in touch with NIAD. They helped us a lot in terms of methods and potential structure, because like the content itself is different, of course, or the medium, right? It's pictures and photographs and, you know, physical things as opposed to digital. But the way that it's stored is very similar. I mean, they're still uncovering, I mean, many different Holocaust studies, you know, spaces, like different ways of using content from 70 years ago, you know. So I think there's a lot to learn, you know. But there's other groups as well who have used content, maybe not digital, but content for different types of transitional or transformational justice stuff. In Chile, for example, right? They collected all of these testimonies. The state collected all of these testimonies of people who were victims or family members of the Pinochet regime, for lack of better terms. You know, there was, I mean, yeah, but the state didn't make these public. They used these as a way of trying to secure compensation or reparations for crimes committed. And so they use this to give funding to people who are victims or their family members of people who disappeared, let's say, right, or were tortured. But they still haven't made them public, right? So the state knew what was going on. A summary report was published saying, you know, what happened. I think it was called the Reddick report, but it's been a while since I've looked into it. A summary of the report was published, but there wasn't specifics about specific people. So there's maybe ways of also taking different types of documentation, publishing what's gone on, you know, but not tying it specifically down to a specific person, right? And this was a very state-driven initiative. I think they had promised to publish it. I don't remember if it was 30 or if it was 50 years afterwards. But basically building in a period of time so that people couldn't take you know, vengeance or be re-traumatized or, you know, what have you from all of this information coming out. And that's that period, I think, is coming up very soon, you know, like next couple of years for when some of this information will be made public. Colombia also, you know, like there's been lots of countries that have taken testimony or pieces of content, maybe not necessarily like you know, user-generated content on YouTube or, you know, what have you, or Telegram, but dealing with this in terms of long-term transformational kind of stuff, you know. Yeah, but Chile, I think, would be quite interesting to look at, and they dealt with the ideas of memory, memorialization, reparations, and privacy, I think, in a very, very good way, you know.
Do we have more questions? Because if not, then I will again kind of jump in with another question. Yeah, I guess I'm jumping for it. Which is actually would be connected to what Taras was asking you, Jeff, and what he was responding. I really liked the point that you made about the platform policies and how it actually affected the distribution, but also the, I would say, the long-term storage of the conflict, of the content related to the human rights violation. And pretty much what we're doing with Alexandria in Switzerland is that we're also trying to think about the possible policy recommendations and how this might actually affect, indeed, I would say, this kind of, on the one hand, highly traumatic content, but on the other hand, is kind of very important content, because we ideally want to, indeed, kind of society to be aware about the human rights violation. And I really would love to hear your opinion on this one. What would be your idea about what kind of the sustainable platform policy we can actually use in order to deal with the content related to the human rights violation? Because I would say that personally, I'm really seeing a lot of struggle here. On the one hand, we definitely don't want people to be traumatized. So ideally, we would actually be making sure that the content is not, for instance, accessible to everyone on the YouTube or on the Facebook, especially indeed, because in so many cases, it also raises a lot of privacy issues. On the other hand, we again kind of want society to be informed. So what would you say is actually the way to go here? And also from the practical reason, because we know that machine learning only really doesn't necessarily works really that well, because we can again train the model. It would, let's say, work in 0.85 cases positively. But then it would, for instance, be filtering out content that we potentially would actually like to stay there. We can definitely go for the human codex. And as far as I understand from your talk, when actually platforms started actually employing humans, it actually helped. But then the question is how sustainable it again, considering that we're actually having kind of the exponential growth of the volume of the content every year. So I would really love to hear your thoughts on this one, Jeff.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I would say there's a lot of people who have been working on issues of content moderation policy. I mean, we're far from the only ones. You know, there's many groups, mostly based in Europe and in the US. It's a very hard question. After there was a white supremacist attack in New Zealand a couple of years ago, who live streamed themselves murdering people in mosques. And so there was a call after this called the Christchurch call, which I think the anniversary of which is coming up soon, actually, to try to create rules on violent extremist content, right? The issue is, how do you say what is violent and extremist and what's human rights documentation? When we were working, I mean, for a couple of years now on some of these issues, you know, what we could do is we could bring real examples of stuff that has been taken down and why, right? And what this looked like before. Like violence means different things in different contexts. There was not very much political will, let's say, in the context of Syria or in the context of Yemen, to preserve this, you know. by platforms. You know, early on we were able to talk with platforms to get things reinstated that had inadvertently been removed. 600,000 videos, for example, on YouTube. But we can't really do that anymore in the same way that we did then. It seems that in the context of Ukraine, there is more political will than there was in the context of Syria, you know, for whatever reasons, you know, may be. There's already discussions happening in the US where many of these tech companies are based about preserving this content. These are discussions that were being pushed for years, but, you know, now are being taken up. So this might be a potential way of dealing with it, you know, in a way that we hadn't seen before. On the other hand, right, issues, there's two main issues. One is preservation and one is access, right? So if you, like, the first thing that should be done, I think, is to preserve the content, right? And you can always figure out access later. But one, you know, if you don't preserve it, then you can't access it at all, right? And it seems like in the US right now, there's some discussions about preservation that are going on in the with a particular focus on Ukraine. I don't know that they have developed so much these platforms, right? But we'll see what happens, because it seems that there's interest in doing so. But access becomes a bigger issue, I think, because, you know, people are calling for maybe human rights groups, you know, to have access, right? But who's the human rights group and where, right? People are calling for academics, you know, to maybe have access, but again, it's like, you know, from where, you know, and for what purpose? And as you said, you don't maybe want everything to be public, so so like we've done some research on this. We have this also on our site. We've been involved for a couple of years in discussions about the idea of like evidence lockers, right? So preserve it and give limited access to certain groups, you know, or individuals or agencies or what have you, for platforms to automate, you know, holding on to some of this content for a certain amount of time. You know, so far they haven't really gone that far, to be completely honest. You know, both in terms of the preservation issue and also in terms of the access. I don't know if, I mean, that's not a clear answer, but I hope, yeah, I mean, but there's many people in the space, you know, and specifically in Europe, there's a couple of bills that are being proposed right now. The Digital Service Act, for example, and Digital Marketing Act, or DMA, or I forget how it's phrased exactly, and some others. In the US, there's different laws, of course. There is some discussions on these, but I think there's ways of potentially buying into the existing networks that are already doing some stuff, especially if you have connections to people, you know, based at civil society groups in Brussels, for example, you know, where some of these discussions are happening. If not, I'm sure that I can connect you. I mean, this person, Dia, from my organization, is mostly leading on the policy advocacy, largely in touch with Brussels-based groups, as well as US, and we can maybe set up a separate call to talk about some of those issues, you know, and see if there's ways of kind of bringing in some of the content. Yeah, perfect, great.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. We have 7 minutes left. Do we have one last question? Because if not, then I guess we will be wrapping up. Okay.
Just thank you to.
We can start the phase of thanking.
Yeah, and actually, thank you for this very inspirational talk and very informative one for us as well. There's a lot of prospects of like directions where we can go and strategies that we can choose, and also very inspirational in terms of seeing that such a archiving initiatives could last in a long-term perspective and could be sustainable in long-term perspective. It is very, very important to see this experience and to learn from it for us. So thank you.
I can just resonate what Taras and Bogdan know. So thank you so much, Jeff. It was really such a great talk, and also so many interesting insights. It was just really fabulous. So
Thanks so much. And again, for having me. I mean, like when we started, we had no money, right? So it's really possible to do this kind of work with like limited resources and limited funds. And like, there's a lot more development that has happened since the last 10 years. But if anybody has follow-up questions, like feel free to reach out, by email. Maybe I can just drop my email here.
Yeah, that would be great.
And if there's like, interest in doing a meeting or something about specific questions, if I'm not the right person, then I'm sure I can connect you to the right person from my team who is.
Perfect. I will be probably also contacting you on the titles for the some of the software solutions that you mentioned, because I'm not sure if I noted it correctly, but it probably will be one of in several other questions as well. So thank you again.
What about Mnemonic? It's now an NGO, or
yeah,
what is the status?
Yeah, exactly. So we formed formally as an NGO because in 2018 under Mnemonic, because we were, for example, dealing with multiple countries, and also we were dealing with content moderation, and we didn't think, for example, it made sense talking to Facebook about Yemen as Syrian Archive, right? So we needed to have kind of a non-country specific, umbrella kind of thing that has these different country specific programs underneath.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of like holding things together, I suppose. But most of the people who are working on specific country specific projects. For Ukraine, actually, we just had job postings for a researcher, for a program manager, for example. I'm not sure if those are all filled yet, but I know that there's some of the positions are up.
You can share your information also.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, thanks once more. I'm pretty sure that probably we also on our side would be in contact, because there are definitely some interesting things we can discuss. And yeah, it was definitely great to actually learn more about what you're doing. So
perfect. Thanks so much, everyone, for having me and for all the really good questions.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.